Culture of London have raised £3.1 million towards funding the centre, but Harrow Council are now thinking of closing it. Could we have a debate in government time on the future of community and cultural centres across the UK?
There may be an opportunity for my honourable friend either at Westminster Hall or at CLG Questions on the 24th of April, but I hope that when Harrow Council takes its decisions that they will take account of the strong representations from my honourable friend and his constituents.
Sir Alex Salmond.
The Leader of the House is known as a great big planner. So how much time is he planning to have on these 19,000 statutory instruments, piece of legislation, other instruments, on the Great Repeal Bill and its attendant legislation in this place over the next 2 years, so that Parliament can fulfil its job of parliamentary scrutiny? How much time is he planning?
Mr. Speaker, we will have to wait for the bill to be published and the statutory instruments to be brought forward. But of course, a statutory instrument can only be dealt with by whatever procedure this House and the other place have approved in the parent Act of Parliament. But I can say to the right honourable gentleman and to the House that the 19,000 figure he's just given to the House is very far-fetched. In my view, that the number concerned is going to be nothing like that.
David Nuttall.
Speaker, can I thank the Leader of the House for making a written statement today on the technical review of the English votes for English law standing orders and responding in particular to the report of the Procedure Committee. Does my right honourable friend agree that the 12 pages may be summarised simply by saying that there will be no changes at the moment, but the provisions will be kept under review?
I think that's a very fair summary.
Right.
Speaker, will the Leader of the House make time available for a series of debates, which I think it would be appropriate for the Cabinet Office to respond to, so that they can update us on the progress of the £350 million per week for the NHS, the reduction in immigration, the cut in VAT on fuel, and they could also update us on the increased associated costs with setting up parallel organisations to the ECJ, Euratom and REACH.
What the Cabinet Office is very active in doing is to ensure that the pledges given in the manifesto on which this government was elected are delivered, whether through legislation or through other means, but the points to which the honourable gentleman referred have not been a part of the government's manifesto.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could we have an urgent debate to clarify the Prime Minister's negotiating stance with the EU? Because if you extrapolate her wish list from both the statement in the House yesterday and her letter to President Tusk, the only conclusion you can come to is either being a member of the European Union or a member of the single market.
What the Prime Minister said yesterday was absolutely consistent with what she said both in her Lancaster House speech and in the subsequent White Paper. We're at the start of a complex and challenging period of negotiation, and as my right honourable friend said yesterday, there is going to need to be political will and give and take on both sides, but we are looking forward to that task and entering it into it in a constructive spirit.
Kirsty Blackman.
Would the Leader of the House ensure that a statement is made explaining to young people why his government believes it's more important to reduce inward migration than it is to protect the freedoms that I have enjoyed so that my children can enjoy them too?
We want, Mr. Speaker, to implement the decision that the people of the United Kingdom took in the referendum on membership of the European Union. That will clearly involve a change from the existing arrangements on free movement, which are provided under European law. The exact nature of movement rights and opportunities are things that that Home Office ministers in particular will be reflecting on, but are also going to be part of a conversation between ourselves and other European governments.
Ian Paisley.
Mr. Speaker, options are clearly narrowing in Northern Ireland. What time is he setting aside to prepare to do business on the floor of this House on Northern Ireland after the 18th of April?
As the honourable gentleman knows, it is the government's wish that devolved government in Northern Ireland can be resumed at the earliest possible opportunity. We have no wish to see a resumption of direct rule. I have obviously been talking to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland regularly in recent weeks. As the honourable gentleman would expect, the government makes plans for many different contingencies.
Phil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Commercial burglaries and serious knife crime remain persistent problems in parts of Walworth, Bermondsey, Rotherhithe in my constituency. When will the government provide time to debate the very worrying findings of the HMIC report, which shows that police across the country do not have the resources to investigate all crime, and that the Met in London has 700 fewer detectives than needed?
I point the honourable gentleman towards the success of the police in London and outside London in reducing crime, despite having to make some difficult choices about budgetary management. The police have done that by reorganising their own operations and their own priorities to ensure that cutting crime successfully comes first, and by implementing and spreading best practice.
Patrick Grady.
Mr. Speaker, it's barely mentioned in his evil technical review, so will he finally admit that, contrary to what his predecessor told us, it is simply not possible for Scottish MPs to debate or vote on Barnett consequentials through the estimates process?
There is a report on, from the Select Committee on Procedure that is due later this year on the estimates procedure, which I will want to consider and to which the government will, of course, reply in detail in due course. But the basic problem is that it's the nature of devolution that a budgetary decision taken here that has Barnett consequentials for Scotland does not ring-fence that Scottish funding for the same subject on which it might be spent here. It's up to the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, how that money is spent. So there is not a direct read-across.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every day I hear another story of a person who discovers they've been duped into buying a leasehold property. Lenders are now refusing to grant mortgages on these homes, threatening the very integrity of the housing market. The Prime Minister said on the 1st of March there was no reason for these properties to be sold on a leasehold basis. When will the government find time to introduce legislation to put those words into action?
This is something that my honourable friend, the Minister for Housing, is taking very seriously. I draw the honourable gentleman's concern to his attention, but I can assure him that he is on top of this issue.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the House will be aware that paragraph 25 of the European Parliament's draft motion on Brexit makes it clear that passporting for financial services will not be countenanced. Financial services are of key importance to Edinburgh and to many of my constituents who work in the sector. Can we have a debate in government time to hear how the UK government intends to support our financial services organisations, which are facing serious disruptions as a result of this?
Well, I'd refer the honourable lady back to the Prime Minister's letter yesterday, which had explicit mention of our objective of securing trade access for our financial services and, of course, reciprocal rights for financial services firms based in other European Union countries here. But she tempts me to start speculating about a forthcoming negotiation, and as she knows, that's not something I'll be prepared to do.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Small businesses in my constituency got little confidence from the Prime Minister's statement yesterday. We were promised debates in government time over important issues impacting on leaving the EU, like workers' rights and environmental protections and for small businesses, yet these haven't happened. Will the Leader publish a schedule of debates in government time that we can have on these important factors?
I can promise the honourable lady that there are going to be numerous opportunities, particularly in the forthcoming parliamentary session, for every aspect of our departure from the European Union to be debated.
Mark Durkan.
If the cross-party talks in Northern Ireland are to inform the legislation that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland brings forward late in April, can the Leader of the House assure us that business constraints in this House will not be used as an excuse for saying that that legislation and those talks should not address serious issues like how the First and Deputy First Minister are jointly elected and the petitions of concern?
My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, as the honourable gentleman knows, did say in his statement earlier this week that he might need to bring legislation forward, not least to address the possibility of there not being funding for essential public services in Northern Ireland. I think it would be wrong for me to speculate here about the exact nature of legislation that might conceivably be brought forward. We still hope that that proves not to be necessary, and the Secretary of State continues to work tirelessly with the political parties to try to secure the restoration of devolved government.
Nick Cook.
Mr. Speaker, fly tipping is a blight on the lives of residents across my constituency, particularly those living in Plumstead. Can we have a debate about what more the government can do, particularly in regards to the powers available to local authorities to tackle this problem?
An opportunity at questions to the Environment Secretary on Thursday the 20th of April. There are quite significant powers available to local authorities. Local authorities sometimes also work with police forces because organised crime is quite often involved in large-scale fly tipping. So I'm sure there is good practice that can be shared around the country, but I'll flag the honourable gentleman's concern with the relevant minister.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, my 33-year-old constituent Caroline was given just 2 months to live because of an untreatable brain tumour, and her continuing quality of life is attributed by many of those treating her to a reluctant decision to take a daily dose of cannabis oil. Can we have a debate in this chamber about whether it really can be right for those such as Caroline to be criminalised, hindering her treatment and discouraging others from making the same decision?
Well, I'd like to express sympathy and support to his constituent and her family. It is, of course, possible for a medicine that has been developed on the basis of cannabinoids to be properly licensed to go through the necessary safety procedures that we have for any medicine in the United Kingdom before they are made available through the National Health Service or generally. And I would be very reluctant to go to dispense with a system that is put in place in order to ensure patient safety. I think that prosecuting authorities have powers of discretion, and I would hope very much, if given the circumstances he has described, that everybody will look at the case with nothing but compassion.
Gavin Newlands.
The Leader will no doubt be aware of the case of Mustafa Bashir, who was spared jail despite repeatedly beating his wife, including forcing her to take tablets and drink bleach and telling her to kill herself, and hitting her over the head with a cricket bat, saying, "If I hit you with this, with my full power, you would be dead." Now, I fully support the independence of the judiciary, but can we have a debate on sentencing guidelines for domestic violence perpetrators?
This government has, of course, brought in legislation to strengthen the penalties for domestic violence. It's something that the Prime Minister, both as Home Secretary and now, takes a very close interest in and to which she gives a high priority. Sentencing guidelines, as the honourable gentleman knows, are published by independent sentencing councils, and individual decisions are taken by judges. But certainly in England and Wales, a consultation has started today on a new sentencing guideline to apply to all cases of domestic abuse, and I would hope that perhaps authorities in Scotland might consider following suit.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the PM's Article 50 letter yesterday, senior figures in Brussels have complained that she's issued a blatant threat and is treating security as a bargaining chip. Can we have a debate about the art of negotiation in government time, so that the government might learn that bullying and threats are not an effective way to get a good deal with our allies?
I'm really sorry that the honourable lady, particularly with her legal expertise, is giving credence to such nonsense. The facts are that our participation in European arrangements on the sharing of information between police forces and between judicial systems rests upon instruments based in the treaties and grounded in European law. Under Article 50, on the day that we depart the EU, the treaties, and therefore all instruments flowing from the treaties cease to apply to the United Kingdom. That is why we say that we are ambitious for an agreement, a new, deep special partnership with our EU neighbours, which encompasses security cooperation as well as trade. I would wish the Honourable Lady would support that.
Oswald.
Mr. Speaker, last week RBS announced their plan to close their busy Newton Mearns branch. East Renfrewshire was already the area worst affected by bank closures before this news. So can we have an urgent debate on RBS's surprising assertion that branches remain a core part of their offering to customers when this is patently not the case?
Well, obviously it's a commercial decision for RBS, but as with any bank, I would hope that they would stick to the code to which they all say they adhere, which is that they would continue to ensure, in particular, that the last branch of a retail bank in any particular community is not closed except in the most extreme circumstances.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kind of a statement from the Leader of the House explains why the Government thinks it's fair to take half the surpluses on a year-on-year basis from the Mine Workers' Pension Fund.
I will ask the relevant minister to write to the honourable gentleman.
Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask for a debate in government time or for a statement regarding the abuse of job trials by unscrupulous employers? One instance that was brought to my attention by a constituent who worked for a week without pay for the Juice Garden Company, who have now been dropped by the DWP, who acknowledged the abusive contract by that company. Does the Leader of the House share my concern? These companies are making free use of free labour above and beyond what is reasonable for a job trial.
We think that all workers should be treated properly and certainly in accordance with employment law, and we would expect responsible employers to treat people who want a work trial or work experience of some kind with decency as well.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Amongst the sporting and shooting organisations and individual firearms certificate holders, there is much concern about the delays for licence renewal and applications. One way of addressing that issue would be the extension of a firearms certificate for a 10 or 20-year period, thereby reducing administrative resources and costs. So would the Leader of the House agree to a statement from the relevant minister on how to deliver a 10-year or 20-year firearms certificate?
I'll ask the minister to write to him, but I'm sure he would understand that a balance has to be struck between the problem that he's described and the need to ensure that we do know where potentially lethal weapons are and that they are in the right hands.
Order. Statement the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Secretary David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement about today's publication of a white paper on the Great Repeal Bill. Yesterday, we took the historic step of notifying the European Council of the Government's decision to invoke Article 50. The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. That notification marks the beginning of our 2-year negotiation period with the EU, and it reflects the result of last year's instruction from the people of the United Kingdom. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, it's our fierce determination to get the right deal for every single person. Now is the time to come together to ensure that the UK as a whole is prepared for the challenges and opportunities presented by our exit from the EU. We have been clear that we want a smooth and orderly exit, and the Great Repeal Bill is integral to that approach. It will provide clarity and certainty for businesses, workers and consumers across the United Kingdom on the day we leave the EU. It will mean that as we exit the EU and seek a new, deep and special partnership with the European Union, we'll be doing so from a position where we have the same standards and rules. But it will also ensure that we deliver on our promise to end the supremacy of European Union law in the UK as we exit. Our laws will then be made in London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and interpreted not by judges in Luxembourg, but by judges across the United Kingdom. Some have been concerned that Parliament will not play enough of a role in shaping the future of the country once we have left the European Union. Today's White Paper shows just how wrong that is. This publication makes clear there will be a series of bills to debate and vote on, both before and after we leave, as well as many statutory instruments to consider. Let me turn to the content of today's White Paper, Mr. Speaker. The paper we have published today sets out three principal elements of this Great Repeal Bill. First, we will repeal the European Communities Act and return power to the United Kingdom. Second, the bill will convert EU law into United Kingdom law, allowing businesses to continue operating, knowing the rules have not changed overnight, and providing fairness to individuals whose rights and obligations will not be subject to sudden change. And third, the bill will create the necessary powers to correct the laws that do not operate appropriately once we have left the EU, so that our legal system continues to function correctly outside the European Union. I'll address each of these elements in turn, Mr. Speaker, before coming to the important issue of interaction of the bill with devolution settlements. Let me begin with the European Communities Act. Repealing the ECA on the day we leave the EU enables a return to this Parliament of the sovereignty we ceded in 1972 and ends the supremacy of EU law in this country. It's necessary, it's entirely necessary to deliver on the result of the referendum. But repealing the ECA alone is not enough. A simple repeal of the ECA would leave holes in our statute book. The EU regulations that apply directly into the UK would no longer have any effect, and many of the domestic regulations we have made to implement our EU obligations would fall away. Therefore, to provide the maximum possible legal certainty, the Great Repeal Bill will convert EU law into domestic law on the day we leave the European Union. This means, for example, that the workers' rights, environmental protection and consumer rights that are enjoyed under EU law in the UK will continue to be available in the UK law after we've left the European Union. Once EU law has been converted into domestic law, Parliament will be able to pass legislation to amend, repeal or improve any piece of European Union law it chooses, as will the devolved legislatures where they have the power to do so. However, further steps will be needed to provide a smooth and orderly exit. This is because a large number of laws, both existing domestic laws and those we convert into UK law, will not work properly if we leave the EU without taking further action. Some laws, for example, grant functions to an EU institution with which the UK will no longer have a relationship. To overcome this, the Great Repeal Bill will provide a power to correct the statute book where necessary to resolve the problems which will occur as a consequence of leaving the European Union. This will be done using secondary legislation, the flexibility of which will make sure we have put in place the necessary corrections before the day we leave the European Union. I can confirm that this power will be time limited, and Parliament will need to be satisfied that the procedures in the bill for making and approving the secondary legislation are appropriate. Given the scale of the changes that will be necessary and the finite amount of time available to make them, there is a balance to be struck between the importance of scrutiny and correcting the statute book in time. As the Constitution Committee in the other place recently put it, the Lord's Constitution Committee, the challenge Parliament will face is in balancing the need for speed and thus for governmental discretion with the need for proper parliamentary control of the content of the UK statute book. Parliament, of course, can and does regularly debate and vote on secondary legislation. We're not considering some form of governmental executive orders, but using a legislative process of long standing. Now, I hope today's White Paper and this statement can be the start of a discussion between Parliament and Government about how best to achieve this balance. Similar corrections will be needed to the statute books of the three devolved administrations. And so we propose that the bill will also give ministers in the devolved administrations a power to amend devolved legislation to correct their law in line with the way the UK ministers will be able to correct UK law. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the European Court of Justice and its case law. I can confirm that the Great Repeal Bill will provide no future role for the European Court in the interpretation of our laws, and the bill will not oblige our courts to consider cases decided by the European Court of Justice after we have left. However, for as long as EU-derived law remains on the UK statute book, it is essential that there is a common understanding of what that law means. The Government believes that this is best achieved by providing for continuity in how that law is interpreted before and after exit day. To maximise certainty, therefore, the bill will provide that any question as to the meaning of EU law which has been converted into UK law will be determined in the UK courts by reference to the European Court of Justice's case law as it exists on the day we leave the European Union. Any other starting point would be to change the law and create unnecessary uncertainty. This approach maximises legal certainty at the point of departure, but our intention is not to fossilise the past decisions of the European Court of Justice. As such, we propose the bill will provide that the European Court case law be given the same status in our courts as decisions of our own Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does not frequently depart from its own decisions, but it does so from time to time. And we would expect the Supreme Court to take a similar, sparing approach to departing from the European Court of Justice case law, but we believe it's right it should have the power to do so. And of course, Parliament will be free to change the law and therefore overturn case law where it decides it's right to do so. Mr. Speaker, today's White Paper also sets out the Great Repeal Bill's approach to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now, let me explain our approach here. The Charter of Fundamental Rights only applies to Member States when they act within the scope of European Union law. This means its relevance is removed by our withdrawal from the European Union. Now, the Government has been clear that in leaving the European Union, the UK's leading role in protecting and advancing human rights will not change. And the fact that the Charter will fall away will not mean the protection of rights in the UK will suffer as a result. The Charter of Fundamental Rights is not designed to create new rights, but rather to catalogue rights already recognised as general principles in EU law, something recognised by the Labour government that brought it in with a protocol attached to it back in 2007. Now, where cases have been decided by reference to those rights, that case law will continue to be used to interpret the underlying rights, which will be preserved. Mr. Speaker, I'd now like to turn to devolution. The United Kingdom's domestic constitutional arrangements have evolved since the UK joined the European Economic Community in 1973. The current devolution settlements were agreed after the UK joined and reflect that context. In areas where the devolved administrations and legislatures have competence, such as agriculture, the environment, some areas of transport, this competence is exercised within the constraints set by European Union law. The existence of common EU frameworks has had the effect of providing a common UK framework in many areas, safeguarding the functioning of the UK internal market. As powers return from the EU, we have an opportunity to determine the level best placed to take decisions on these issues, ensuring power sits closer to the people of the United Kingdom than ever before. It is the expectation of the Government that the outcome of this process will be a significant increase in the decision-making power of each devolved administration. But we must also ensure that, as we leave the European Union, no new barriers to living and doing business within our own union are created. In some areas, this will require common UK frameworks. Decisions will be required about where a common framework is needed, and if it is, how it might be established. The devolved administrations also acknowledge the importance of common UK frameworks. We will work closely with the devolved administrations to deliver an approach that works for the whole of the United Kingdom and reflects the needs and individual circumstances of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Let me conclude by stressing the importance of the Great Repeal Bill. It will help to ensure certainty and stability across the board. It's vital to ensuring a smooth and orderly exit. It will stand us in good stead for the negotiations over our future relationship with the EU, and it will deliver greater control over our laws to this Parliament and, wherever appropriate, the devolved administrations. These steps are crucial to implementing the result of the referendum in the national interest. I hope all sides will recognise that and work with us to achieve these aims. I commend this statement to the House.
Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for early sight of his statement and of the White Paper. Mr. Speaker, nobody underestimates the task of converting EU law into domestic law. The question is, how is it done and what is done? The White Paper on the question of how gives sweeping powers to the executive. Sweeping because it proposes a power to use delegated legislation to correct and thus change primary legislation and also devolve legislation by delegated legislation. Sweeping because of the sheer scale of the exercise.
Now, in those circumstances, one might expect some pretty rigorous safeguards to the use of these sweeping powers, but none are found in the White Paper. On the contrary, at paragraph 3.20, the White Paper says this: given the scale of the changes that will be necessary and the finite amount of time available to make them, there is a balance that will have to be struck between the importance of scrutiny and the speed of the process. And it goes on to say the government proposes using existing types of statutory instrument procedure, so there's no enhanced safeguards for this sweeping use of powers. Mr. Speaker, I think in those circumstances we have to go back to first principles, and that is there should be no change to rights and protections without primary legislation. That is a starting and basic principle, and the same goes for policy. And I add this: when we see the bill, there must be no power to change rights and obligations and protections in the future by delegated legislation. And I ask the Secretary of State to provide assurance on those basic principles this morning, and I ask him to look again at safeguards for the delegated legislation procedures that are proposed. As to the what is to happen in relation to converting law into domestic law, again there have to be clear principles, and they're these: all rights and protections derived from EU law must be converted into domestic law. All rights and protections, no limitations, no qualifications, and no sunset clauses. And this morning we need an assurance from the Secretary of State that he will face down those on his own side who will not be able to resist the temptation to water these rights and protections down before they're even put into this bill. I remind him that the International Development Secretary in the referendum campaign said that she thought we should, quote, halve the burden of EU social employment rights. And the International Trade Secretary said we must begin by deregulating the labour market. So we need an assurance that those temptations will be faced down when this bill is put before this House. I turn to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which it's proposed will be left out altogether. That, of course, codifies in modern form all EU rights. It's not directly enforceable, it is a codification, but it's nonetheless influential, and it's wrong simply to leave it out. I note what's said in the White Paper at paragraph 1.12, but I seek from the Secretary of State an assurance that all relevant rights in the Charter, I accept some are not relevant, the right to vote in the European Parliament, for example, but all relevant substantial rights in the Charter will be converted into domestic law through this bill. And finally, Mr. Speaker, on devolved bodies, Brexit should not be an excuse to hoard powers in Whitehall, and there has to be a heavy presumption that devolved matters remain devolved as powers and responsibilities transfer from the EU to the UK. And I ask the Secretary of State to give that assurance this morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Let me start. When I finished what I said in the statement, I actually said I hope the House will come together in making this task happen. And I reiterate that point, particularly to the Labour spokesman, Marpset Number. He's said no change to rights by delegated legislation. That, I would have thought, almost goes without saying. I was going to say, it almost goes without saying, but I've actually said it in my statement, if he reads it. But let me reiterate. The use of delegated legislation will be for technical changes. The sort of alterations where we're talking, as I said, on one occasion to a regulatory body, let's say, in the European Union, which clearly has to be replaced by one within the UK. So I think that is, frankly, as plain as a pikestaff. He changed it slightly to all relevant rights. He's quite right, because there are things like the right to stand as an MEP, the right to elect an MEP, and indeed the right of direct application to European Court, of course, will go automatically. And I think he accepts that too. I mean, he's a reasonable man, and I take it that he will accept that. In terms of charter rights, let me just remind him of what happened when I think it was the Lisbon Treaty, anyway, in 2007, the Labour government today negotiated that. And they negotiated a protocol to it, which the Prime Minister today said it is absolutely clear that we have an opt-out from both the Charter and the Judicial Home Affairs. Now, actually, the Prime Minister today, Mr Tony Blair, was wrong to say that. He had misunderstood their own protocol. But what the protocol did was to guarantee that there were no new rights arising as a result of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And that was reiterated later by the then government in court, reiterated by the Europe Minister. The protocol confirms that since the Charter creates no rights or circumstances in which those rights can be relied upon before the courts, it does not change the status quo. The White Paper of 2007 said the same, and only last year, in December, I think, the Joint Committee on Human Rights reiterated that understanding. So we looked at that very carefully, because as he might understand, he might appreciate, this is an area which I took very seriously indeed. If I make this offer to him, apart from the undertakings he's asked for, I also make this offer to him that if we turn out in the sort of next 2 years to find something we've missed, we'll put it right. We'll put it right. And so I think on that basis, I don't think we have an argument. I don't actually think that will happen either, because every indication, indeed a clause by clause search through the whole of the Charter didn't throw up a significant issue other than things like the MEP matter and so on. In terms of the treatment of devolved administrations, the first thing to say is no powers currently exercised by them will be taken away. That's the first thing. We've said that time and again. We also expect there to be a significant increase in the powers exercised by the devolved administrations. But I say this to him: we have to maintain the United Kingdom internal market too. I mean, that is 4 times as important to Scottish businesses, for example, as the European market is. It's incredibly important to Northern Irish businesses and Welsh businesses too. And the administrations understand that. But we will be having discussions with them at length. We've already started having discussions with them at length about how we exercise this. And I'm very happy as well to talk to him directly on the matter if that is useful to him. I reiterate, this is a difficult task, but is by no means beyond this House to achieve this, and achieve this properly, respecting our democracy, but also delivering for the British people.
Order. I gently remind honourable members who arrived after the statement started that they certainly shouldn't expect to be called, and although I'm very keen to accommodate the extensive interest in this statement, there are 2 well-subscribed debates under the auspices of the Backbench Business Committee to follow, to which I have to have regard. So we need short questions and short answers. Sir William Cash.
Mr. Speaker, may I commend my right honourable friend on the clarity and the thoughtful analysis that lies behind this white paper. Could I also say that, as respects the Great Repeal Bill, the reality is that what we will be doing is returning sovereignty to this House, so that the decisions that are taken in our lawmaking are made by the British people's representatives in this House, in line with the wishes in general elections, and not, and I'd advise the opposition to bear this in mind, as it is at present, so often as we find the European Scrutiny Committee behind closed doors. Yeah.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for those comments, and I'm going to take this opportunity of also thanking him for his work in this area over the years. Some of the ideas in this policy area came from his writing in the past, so he is right. It's also, I'll make the point to him, people who complain about the use of secondary legislation. The secondary legislation we're talking about, I mean, nearly 8,000 items of secondary legislation we use, SIs we used, to implement European law under the Section 2.2 of the European Communities Act 1972. So it's a little hypocritical, I think, to attack that from there. But I thank him for his comments, and I commend him for his work in the past.
Stephen Gethins.
On these benches, we think the triggering of Article 50 yesterday was a sad day for everybody in Europe, including everybody in these islands, and an EU that for years has brought us peace, stability, security and prosperity. We're turning the clock back 40 years, and I'm glad that the Minister reminded his own front benches that devolution existed now in a way it didn't exist 40 years ago. It's been suggested that the government is looking at Henry VIII clauses to take this through. So much for parliamentary sovereignty.
Hear, hear.
Scotland's aspirations for a voice also seem to be given the Henry VIII treatment, with a rough wooing clearly taking place right now. Can I ask the Minister, will he tell us where the legislative consent motions will be required, where responsibility, and I quote, will flow from Brussels to Edinburgh, hardly touching the sides on the way, and who does he mean by democratically elected representatives in section 4.2? Mr. Speaker, it strikes me that the government has pushed the big red button marked Brexit with their fingers crossed and very little idea of what comes next.
Let me say this to the honourable gentleman. He loves this Henry VIII clause. He thinks that the public at large will think that's some executive fiat dating from the Middle Ages. Of course, what we're talking about here is the use of a procedure which has been used down the last century, and over which this House has complete control. Complete control. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I have been in joint committees with his colleague in the Scottish Government and other DA, devolved administrations, over the last 6 months or more. And these issues I have raised, and bilaterally, and said to them that we will have serious discussions with them about this, because my preference is for more devolution rather than less. That's my simple viewpoint. And the constraint on that, however, is where it has direct effect on the whole United Kingdom's interests. So that is the United Kingdom's market. It would be very bad for Scottish farmers and for Scottish producers if the United Kingdom market became separated from them. Issues of national security, which we need to deal with. Issues of international negotiation and observing of international obligations, such as in environmental law. So there's been plenty of areas where it's clear we need to have a UK-wide framework, and that's the sort of criterion we will apply, and we will discuss it at length with the devolved administrations at every stage.
Redwood.
This should be called the Continuity Bill, and it should be very reassuring to all Remain voters, as it's the means to keep the rights and laws from Europe that they most like. Would my right honourable friend confirm that any MP who wants to keep EU employment rights, for example, must vote for this bill?
My right honourable friend is right. I lay some claim to the ideas behind the bill, but not for the name of it. I have to tell him. He's right. It is, to a very large extent, a continuity bill. It is the way in which we will protect employment rights, environment rights, a whole series of rights. And he's quite right. Those who want to preserve those rights should vote without any thought for this bill.
Nick Clegg.
I'd like to commend the Secretary of State for ignoring some of the more over-excitable demands from parts of the Brexit press and some of his backbenchers, and to confirm, as he has today, that he will incorporate into British law some of the EU jewels in their crown, such as the Habitats Directive, the Working Time Directive, the Green Renewable Energy Directive, which we can all agree upon, though he will know there is a fork in the road. The government will either have to keep those provisions in domestic legislation, in which case they will reasonably say, what on earth was the point of leaving the EU in the first place, or he will remove those provisions, in which case the EU will need exacting safeguards to ensure that we're not undercutting EU standards. My question to him is this: will he reconfirm to the House that it is impossible to do what the Prime Minister said yesterday, to participate fully in crime-fighting, anti-terrorism EU measures without access to the databases, the Schengen Information Service and other databases, which I remember from my time in government are such devastating crime-fighting tools, without abiding by EU data protection directives overseen by the European Court of Justice?
Mr. Speaker, after a commendation like the one that the right honourable gentleman started with, I think my career is over. What the Prime Minister was referring to yesterday is, because he is half right and he's half wrong, what the Prime Minister referred to yesterday is, of course, the importance of maintaining either something very similar to or a replacement for the Justice and Home Affairs arrangements, the strand of the European treaties. And he's right in one respect. We will undoubtedly, not just dealing with the EU, dealing with the United States, dealing with other countries too, have data protection, for example, data laws, privacy protection, which meets their standards in order to exchange data with them. We will be at that point. At the day we leave the European Union, what this bill does is ensure we're at that point and therefore able to continue exchanging data. And there's no doubt thereafter that there will be continuing discussions about how we maintain all our standards at the same level, but not just the European Union, with all our allies, whether it's America, Canada, the Five Eyes, everybody.
Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State confirm that the directives the Right Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam referred to are already in British law, and what we're talking about here are what the Foreign Affairs Committee counted as 6,987 regulations that have got to be applied in British law through this. But, however, referring to directives such as Solvency II, which, just used as an example for the equity release industry in the United Kingdom, imposes significantly extra costs, and I think a British directive would actually have. That if we have the opportunity to examine that within the timescale of the time limits he's going to apply and seek for the House to apply to this legislation.
Yes, his general point of directives is right, and his specific point, of course, is right in the sense that the whole point of this is to bring this back to the United Kingdom. We won't change everything by any means. Indeed, we won't want to change everything. We may want to maintain the degree of parallel standards as a part of our own national decision. But it will be brought back to this House of Commons, and we will make the decision on what's best for this country.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government's aim that EU law, with all its rights and protections, will remain in place is a pragmatic approach, and we need to find a way of making that happen. But the Secretary of State will be aware of concerns that others might try and use this process to get rid of EU laws they've never liked, or use these powers to make changes beyond the minimum necessary. Will he therefore commit to consult closely with the Select Committee on the scope of the bill, and is it his intention to publish a draft of it for pre-legislative scrutiny?
Good question.
I'll happily undertake to consult with the Select Committee on this matter. I think the issue is very important. I've already told him privately, so I'll say it publicly, we won't be publishing a draft legislation, but we will be taking on board, as a result of, as after the publication of the White Paper, a great deal of consultation, including with his Select Committee.
Seabury.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend the Secretary of State for his statement today and assure him, of course, that I always listen very carefully to what my right honourable friend says. And, of course, I heard him on the radio this morning explaining that what I had thought was a guarantee that there would be, in his words, an absolute guarantee to deliver exactly the same benefits in the deal in relation to trade and to customs is now apparently an aim, but I'm sure he'll be true to that aim. Mr. Speaker, this is really a great transfer bill. That's what it really is. Could the Secretary of State give an unequivocal undertaking that workers' rights, environmental protections and consumer protections will be in no way changed as a result of this bill, and indeed anything else that is taken in now into consideration?
The Prime Minister has already given those undertakings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Secretary of State on his statement and on the White Paper? It is the right approach to provide certainty once we leave the EU. In relation to the issue of the devolved administrations and greater powers there too, can I ask him, will he be engaging intensively with the devolved administrations in the 2-year period that now lies ahead in relation to where powers should lie, whether in London or in Belfast, Cardiff or Edinburgh?
The answer, the straight answer is yes. One of the reasons this White Paper is a little later in publication than I would have preferred is, of course, the fact that we don't have at this stage a Northern Ireland executive. I waited for the 3 weeks in the hope that we would have one. But at this point, we can't wait any longer. But we will be continuing to consult with the devolved administrations. In the run-up to the election in Northern Ireland, I invited the, as it were, outgoing ministers to come, just to make sure we had a mechanism there, and I will ensure we have another mechanism. I'm not quite sure what it is yet for Northern Ireland, and I'm happy to hear his ideas, but I'll sure have another mechanism to make sure that we also consult with Northern Ireland, whether it's the executive or not. Yeah.
Mr. Pacheco.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for making it clear that 2 years from today, our sovereign parliament will indeed have the power to amend, repeal or improve all this ghastly EU legislation.
I will pass on the assessment of the legislation, but I will, of course, reinforce the point I've already made, which is the aim of this bill at the end of the day is to bring the decisions back to this House.
Dame Rosie Winterton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State says that over the next few years he wants to see maximum scrutiny of legislation. But given the sheer volume, particularly of delegated legislation that he's outlined, does he think it is really feasible to reduce the number of MPs by 50?
Oh. Yes. Well, this is a question which is stratospherically above my pay grade. Let me pick up the underpinning point in terms of the volume of legislation. I would say to the House that we, of course, are bringing a large amount of this legislation straight into UK law without change. The reason for change, the reason for use of the SIs, as I said to the Labour spokesman earlier, is that there will be technical amendments, technical issues which will come up. Separate to that, there will be primary legislation on immigration, on customs, on a variety of other areas. That's different. But the technical legislation will be aiming to make things practical, not to maintain great changes in policy. And this House should be well able to do that.
Julian Lewis.
Leave campaigners will vote for this bill as it's part of the process of withdrawal, but Remain campaigners admire EU law and want its provisions to continue. So can the Secretary of State think of any good reason why the Great Repeal Bill should not be passed unanimously?
No.
Chris Leslie.
The State needs to make it clear now that all of those regulations, protocols relating to justice, home affairs, protection, security and terrorism are going to stay part of our laws and the cooperation requirements that we have upon us. Because in that Article 50 letter yesterday, shamefully, the government suggested that circumstances where we may even consider withdrawing or weakening our cooperation. Shouldn't he realise that that sort of squalid negotiation tactic is going to result in a less good deal than a better one?
The honourable gentleman should know better. The leader of the House was here, who, of course, was previously a Europe minister, and he made it clear in terms that what the Prime Minister was talking about was the fact that existing treaty arrangements, which will end when we leave the European Union, will fall by the wayside. So we will have to find an alternative, not our internal legal rights and privileges, but the treaty arrangements. That's the important thing.
Bob Neal.
I very much welcome the pragmatic approach that the Secretary of State has adopted in this document, and in particular his emphasis upon legal certainty and continuity, which I think you all know is vital for continued business confidence, and something the Justice Committee's report emphasised. Going forward, does he agree that it will be important to maintain a mechanism for ensuring continuing regulatory equivalence, not just in data protection, but important issues like the financial and other service sectors? How might that be taken forward?
Mr. Speaker, I think I'm going to seek your protection. That's two people who've finished my career today, being called pragmatic as well. I mean, the simple truth is that when we come to do the trade deals and the other deals which go forward, there will be relationships between us, as there are with other countries, to ensure that we maintain common standards. I think the point the ex-leader of the Liberal Party made, an ex-Deputy Prime Minister made about data protection and so on. There will be things which we will negotiate, but he would be surprised if I actually talked those negotiations out in this place at this time.
Chris Bryant.
Mr. Speaker, I do worry because the Secretary of State says in his white paper, existing parliamentary procedures allow for Parliament to scrutinise as many or as few statutory instruments as it sees fit. That is simply untrue. In 2014-2015, 9 negative statutory instruments were prayed against by the Leader of the Opposition. Only one was allowed a debate, and that was not on the floor of the House, so it couldn't be a fatal motion. In 2015-16, 19 were prayed against by the Opposition, and only 5 were allowed debates, again only in committee. Not a single one was allowed a vote on the House. This is not bringing back control to this House. We will be worried unless you change the process.
Well, we of course start by obeying the conventions that apply to the House, and I'm afraid, we do have an SI procedure which is both affirmative and negative, which has its effects and influence. But if he wants to come and talk to us about how he thinks we can improve that, I'm happy to see him. I'm happy to see him, not at 2:30, but I'm happy to see him.
And Swain.
That UK judges will be less creative is an open question. The notion of incorporating EU regulation and indeed case law gives me the collywobbles. But I assure my right honourable friend of my support in the division lobby because he has bigger fish to fry.
Well, as the white paper says, we made a very explicit decision that we would aim to make this Supreme Court level precedent. That is to reduce the number of courts that can deal with this just to the Supreme Court itself. And the Supreme Court is fairly careful about changing its own precedent. Indeed, does so relatively rarely. And that's what we expect to continue to be the case. But anything they do, this House can change.
Edwards.
Plaid Cymru is demanding a continuity bill in the National Assembly for Wales to enshrine appropriate European law in Welsh law. Will you confirm today that Westminster will not block or undermine our Parliament's full right to legislate for Wales? Mr Speaker, my message to the British Government today is this from the people of Wales. Hands off our Parliament.
I reiterate, no powers that are currently exercised by the devolved administrations will be taken from them.
Mr Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that the key point about the Great Repeal Bill is that the legal precedence of laws imposed on this country by the EU will end?
Well, the legal precedents won't necessarily end, but they will be susceptible to our change. We will be able to change them both in our courts and our Parliament.
Mr Speaker, with reference to the criminal justice measures of which we are already a part and the Prime Minister's Article 50 letter yesterday, can the Secretary of State set out for the House how the safety and protection of the public would be enhanced by us reducing our cooperation on crime and terrorism?
As the Prime Minister made plain yesterday, she wants to see a comprehensive agreement. Now, people have interpreted that as comprehensive trade. It doesn't just mean comprehensive trade agreement. It's comprehensive agreement across all the issues where we have a relationship with the European Union.
Mark Pawsey.
Speaker, many users of e-cigarettes voted leaving the referendum in the mistaken belief that to do so would prevent the EU Tobacco Products Directive from being applied here. Now, taking that regulation as an example, what opportunity will be there for this House to change provisions of EU law that don't operate appropriately?
Well, that's the point of bringing them back to the House to be able for the House to be able to deal with it. I mean, it'll be right across the board. You've got 40 years of law we're talking about here, and it will take time to correct some of those which we don't agree with. Of course, much of it we do agree with. So that will take time, but the House will have its opportunity.
Ahmed Sheikh.
Speaker, paragraph 4.4 speaks of working closely with devolved administrations for an approach that works for the whole in each part of the UK. I can't help but feel that it's déjà vu all over again, and this government has so far done nothing to demonstrate its intention to work with the devolved administrations. If the government continues with its unsustainable approach of ignoring the will of the Scottish Parliament in relation to Brexit and indeed any other issue, can I ask the Secretary of State why the devolved administration should trust the UK government on anything?
Sometimes I have to say that the Scottish National Party seems to have one element in its ideology and one element only, and it's entitled grievance and maximisation of grievances. Now, I have attended in the last 6 months 6 meetings with the representatives of devolved administrations. And in a number of the policy areas we have discussed, which made it into the previous white paper, matters such as employment rights, environmental rights, a whole series of other areas like that, an agreement that we need to maintain the maximum possible access to for trade for all parts of the kingdom, we have been in the same place. We, of course, haven't been in the same place on every single element of policy. We never undertook. We said at the beginning the DAs would not be given a veto, but they'd be very, very heavily consulted and discussed with. And that's precisely what we've done. The fact the Scottish National Party wants to claim that it's not happy about it is a matter for it, not a matter for me or the facts.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Speaker, those who wish to remain in the EU bang on about EU rules and regulations. Surely the whole point of leaving the EU is that we in this place can live under our own rules and regulations that are suitable to us, not necessarily to 28 countries as they currently stand.
My honourable friend is exactly right.
Smith. Very grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the inevitable protest from the Secretary of State that he's always appearing before this House, the hallmark of his government so far on this issue has been to avoid scrutiny and evade accountability. And we now learn today that the Great Repeal Bill is actually going to be 1,000 statutory instruments, many of them not scrutinised properly in this place. How on earth can that be commensurate with taking back control and increasing sovereignty of this Parliament?
The honourable gentleman continues in his habit of reading half of what we say and ignoring the other half when it suits him. One of the things I've said from the beginning of this process is that we will bring into British law all European law, including case law, except where there are significant, and this is what this bill will do, this act in due course will do. It will, of course, require SIs to modify technical aspects which are, up to 1,000. But there have been we're talking about 40 years of law. What would he? It's interesting. I would be very interested to hear what he would propose we do about a law which refers to a European regulatory authority. Leave it that way, or maybe have a major debate on that matter. That doesn't strike me as very sensible. The area where there will be material changes, the area where there will be policy changes, will be carried through in primary legislation, of which there will be a number of such bills in the coming Parliament.
Morris. I commend the Secretary of State for his approach to this complex matter, but the White Paper is absent in any discussion about English devolution, and I wondered the extent to which he envisaged that this opens up an opportunity for further legal powers to be devolved to the English regions, and how that might work.
Not deliberately in this white paper, but he will know, for example, the Chancellor announced further devolution of powers. To London, for example, and London has been. I've been talking to the Mayor of London at a very great extent about issues for London in this matter. So not in this white paper, but that's part of the overall government strategy, is to bring government as close as possible to the people.
Heidi Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite government protestations to the contrary, leaving the EU doesn't automatically and necessarily mean leaving the single market. Equally, leaving the Treaty of the European Union doesn't automatically and necessarily mean leaving the European Economic Area Agreement. Will his so-called repeal bill repeal the EEA Act of 1993? And will every member of this House get a specific vote on that specific issue?
I've rarely heard a question based on so many false premises. The truth is, leaving the European Union does, I'm afraid, involve leaving the single market, because the single market requires, as a part of it, the four freedoms. And whatever you think about the vote last year, it was clearly not a vote in favour of allowing the control of migration, the control of laws, and indeed the operation of the European Court of Justice to stay in Europe.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend on his mature and considered approach to the devolved nations? And can I push him on the principle that if the UK internal market, which is so important to my constituency of Cardiff North and our Welsh nation, the principle of the powers, if they don't affect that internal market and are coming back from the EU, that they will be given to the devolved nations as soon as possible?
Yep. Well, as I said, I'm not going to demur from the principle I already outlined, which is, and he's right, the UK single market is several times bigger for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland than the EU single market. The only difference in the case of Northern Ireland is, of course, there's £1 billion a week of trade between them and Ireland. And we will see a significant increase in the amount of powers given to devolved administrations, but we will have to protect matters such as the single market in the UK and other issues such as security, environmental agreements, you name it.
Brady Whiteford.
Mr Speaker, the Government's already signalled its intention to withdraw from the Common Fisheries Policy. However, Chapter 4, paragraphs 2 and 4 of this White Paper seem to suggest not just that the EU powers on issues such as fisheries will revert to the UK Government rather than the devolved institutions, but that the Government, quote, intends to replicate the current frameworks provided by EU rules through UK legislation. Is the Government seriously suggesting that we'll have business as usual for the fishing industry under a CFP framework after Brexit? And if not, will he enlighten us to the Government's plans?
Well, one of the things I'll say to her is, of course, some of this, what she calls business as usual, will be temporary, some of it will be permanent, and that will depend entirely on the criteria I laid down earlier.
ECJ in our domestic courts. Does he agree that this is the only option if we are to truly restore control over our laws to the British people, reverse an ever-intrusive influence by the ECJ on social and economic policy areas, and its operation as a federal court, things which were never envisaged at its conception in 1957?
Well, she's right. That's exactly why the Prime Minister made that a very important central piece of our policy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister didn't mention the customs union in her statement, nor is it referred to in her letter to President Tusk. Paragraph 122 says, "We will introduce a customs bill to establish a framework to implement a UK customs regime." Will the Secretary of State confirm that he intends to take us out of the customs union?
Well, he sort of missed unusually for him as an ex-committee chairman, he missed the fact that she made direct reference to the White Paper, which does cover exactly that point.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know that we can rely on my right honourable friend to be an extremely robust negotiator, but just for the sake of absolute clarity in terms of the role of the European Court of Justice, can he confirm that A, it will have absolutely no authority in the UK, and that he will not in any circumstances water down that commitment during the negotiations?
I was just going to say yes, and I just thought I'd make very plain what we're saying. There will be no reach of the European Court of Justice into the UK. Of course, it is the case that when you sell a product into another country, you meet the rules in that country. So you do it in the United States, you meet the rules which reach up to the Supreme Court. The same will happen in Europe, but it will not reach here.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr Speaker, yesterday, Mr Speaker, you invited me to behave as if I was in a court of law. Can I extend your entirely appropriate invitation to the Secretary of State and suggest that he pretend that he's in a court of law and answer the question posed by my honourable friend, the member for North East Fife? Will this bill require legislative consent motions? Yes or no?
I actually apologise. I forgot the point that he was making in terms of responding to the other ones. At this stage, we don't know, because we don't know the final format of the bill. That's the simple truth.
Robert Courts.
Mr Speaker, I welcome this bill and the certainty that it provides for business as we undergo this process. Could the Secretary of State confirm that that certainty of business will be at the forefront and a priority for him throughout?
Yes, and that's fundamental to the whole strategy behind this bill.
Mrs Ellen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The public are extremely worried about these Henry VIII clauses. In Chapter 3 of his White Paper, he says that one of the areas where he wants to use secondary legislation is on the change from EU institutions. There are 40 of these EU institutions, ranging from medicines to aviation safety. If we lose, he will have a choice. He can either set up a new one or abandon the regulation altogether. Does he really think it's appropriate to do that in statutory instruments?
Well, the 40 are not in the UK. The 40 are across the Union, and it may be, and it may not be. It depends. If, for example, it is If she stops heckling, I'll answer it. If it's adding it to, for example, another regulatory body already in existence, that might well be an appropriate SI. In other cases, if you're creating a regulatory body, that might be appropriate to have a rather heavier level of parliamentary debate and insight to it.
Blackman. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend will be aware that the Procedure Committee is doing an inquiry into how we get the Great Repeal Bill into law. Unfortunately, my right honourable friend has not been able to appear before us. Can I urge him to agree a date when we can help facilitate this Great Repeal Bill process?
I'm happy to say yes, I will be doing so. I mean, that was the intention in any event. It was, I can't remember the reason for deferral last time, but it will happen.
Dr. Roberta Blackman-Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a statement, the Secretary of State said that the bill will convert EU law into UK law wherever practical and appropriate, allowing businesses to continue operating knowing the rules have not changed. But companies like Nissan and Hitachi in the North East need to continue to expand in order to have future prosperity in the North East. So what is the Secretary of State going to do to ensure that opportunities to grow exist and that workers' rights are protected too?
Well, of course, she will have noted that Nissan made an investment decision quite recently, favourable to the North East. It's a little wider than just this white paper. We said, and indeed the Prime Minister said in the Article 50 letter yesterday, that one of the things that was important was putting in place transition arrangements or implementation phase, I think was the phrase used, and that relates exactly to that, to give a degree of certainty.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very lucky to have part of the Peak District National Park in my constituency. And with that in mind, does the Secretary of State agree that this bill is an important vehicle for helping to ensure environmental protections are maintained and the opportunity to enhance them, of course, and anyone supporting those aims should really welcome this bill?
Secretary of State.
Yes, he is exactly right. This bill ensures those protections are maintained, and the only way that would not be the case is if this House made an explicit decision to change them.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker. Reference to disabled people or disability has been scant, if at all, apparent in any of the government white papers. Has the UK government considered at all the impact upon disabled people, who are some of our most vulnerable, and will he confirm there will be no erosion of their rights moving forward?
Well, as a result of this, certainly not. I mean, I can only talk to the white paper here, and one of the things we've been trying to do throughout this is to maintain rights that arise out of European law in British law, and that's what we'll do.
Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, I've known the Secretary of State a long time, and he will expect a rough, tough road ahead as people like me fight for every right our citizens of Europe have in this country, to retain those rights. But is he aware that if he panders too much to the secret and quiet, well, not so secret, agenda of the balmy army Eurosceptics prominent behind him, he will not get the level of cooperation he otherwise would when he talks about pragmatism?
Well, the honourable gentleman has known me a long time. Indeed, I'll tell the House on another occasion how he got me into deep trouble in this House. But what I'll say to him is this: he should, if he listened to my statement, realise what this is about is preserving, to a very large extent, preserving rights that people have got used to and expect to continue to have. And that's what this will do. And I don't know who he's referring to in his rather strange allusions to armies of one sort or another, but he can be sure that the first thing that will cross my mind in dealing with this thing is my conscience.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much. Does the Secretary of State intend that the Great Repeal Bill will devolve some things that are currently reserved and reserve some things that are currently devolved? Or will he be bringing forward a new Scotland bill, and if so, when?
Now, I've made 2 points on this, which I'll reiterate to her. Number one, no decisions currently exercised by devolved administrations will be taken away from them. Secondly, there will be an increase in the number of powers exercised by the devolved administration.
The government seems to overlook the fact that we can't just incorporate into UK law things that are based on a reciprocal arrangement with the rest of our European partners. How long does the Secretary of State think it will take, for example, to renegotiate all the trading arrangements that we have with them?
Well, this white paper does not relate to that. She's right that we have to negotiate reciprocal arrangements. That's quite right. And that's what we will do. I mean, that's why we have proposed a comprehensive negotiation, a comprehensive free trade arrangement. We believe that is eminently achievable because we already have common standards. That's what this bill does, maintain the common standards. And we already have outstanding levels of trade between us. £290 billion of trade from the European Union to us, which they will want to preserve every bit as much as we do.
As we say in Glasgow, where's your parliamentary sovereignty now? This great power grab is taking power from Brussels bureaucrats and handing it to Whitehall mandarins. Given that secondary statutory instruments are not currently subject to legislative consent from the devolved assemblies, can he assure us that no statutory instruments will be used to legislate and devolve matters?
Well, it actually goes back to the issue raised by his spokesman. You know, we will be talking to the devolved administrations about the extent to which this does have impact and making sure that there are increases, not decreases, increases in the powers available to the devolved administrations.
Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State consistently ignores my honourable friend from Lewisham East and a perfectly legitimate point about Article 127 of the 1993 EEA Act, which says that the UK Government has to give 12 months' notice to remove itself from the EEA. So how will that be dealt with in the Great Repeal Bill, or has the Secretary of State simply forgotten about it?
No, but it's not a matter of the Great Repeal Bill.
Mark Durkan.
The great download and save until delete bill is really going to lead to a carnival of reaction, where alongside the so-called bonfire of red tape, we will see ministers competing in a demolition derby to reduce rights, various rights and environmental protections. This is also a charter for dilution before devolution. Does the Secretary of State recognise that for some of us to trust Tory ministers with the sort of holding and moulding powers that he wants to give them would be like asking Attila the Hun to mind our horse?
Didn't know he had a horse, but I'll say this to him. You know, his entire approach to this, his entire assessment of this, is just plain wrong.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Paragraph 320 says the need to trade off scrutiny for speed, whereas paragraph 313 says the government doesn't want to be unduly constrained to adapt EU laws. So is the executive creating a democratic deficit by using secondary legislation, and how can it justify this?
We're not going to create a democratic deficit. This is a white paper. That's what we're here to discuss with Parliament.
Brennan.
Mr. Speaker, so from what the Secretary of State just said, the EEA won't be featured in the bill. So can he confirm to the House then that there's going to be a separate vote in Parliament in relation to the EEA?
Date.
Depending on what the policy decision is, I would think it was quite likely to come to the Parliament.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Speaker, how can trade and security cooperation be maximised if UK courts are interpreting parallel legal provisions completely differently from the European Court of Justice? Surely UK courts will have to continue to consider European court case law as it develops after Brexit and not just as it exists at the point of Brexit, as his statement sought to suggest.
No, not at all. The whole point of this is to bring these laws back within the control of Parliament and our own courts, and they will continue to interpret them in the way they see fit. Now, they may continue to obey precedent previously set, or they may decide to choose it, to decide to change it. That will be a matter for them. Ditto, that will be a matter for this House of Commons to decide whether it wants to change those matters too. I'll just make one side point to him on this, and that is the Supreme Court very often looks at other courts around the world, not just the European Court, but American courts and other courts, in order to make its decisions.
Liz McInnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was no mention of Gibraltar in the Prime Minister's letter yesterday, and I'm pleased to see it does at least get a mention in today's publication. But given that an overwhelming majority of Gibraltarians voted to remain in the EU, can the Secretary of State explain how this bill will give certainty to businesses in Gibraltar?
Well, she sees as an entire section on overseas territories and the like. And my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Secretary, has been in continuous discussion with Gibraltar on these matters, and we will seek to defend their interests as best we can.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Secretary of State be clearer, please? Now, I think he's denied that it could be up to 1,000. So, what's his best estimate? How many EU laws will become UK laws?
Secretary of State.
Well, it's all of the EU laws become UK laws at the point as a result of this bill. There will then be subsequent changes, presumably as primary legislation, for example, on immigration law. He shouts out in French how many, and the simple truth is, I'm not going to try and give him a sort of how, never mind the quality, feel the width answer. All EU law will move into UK law.
Thank you. Order. We now come to the backbench motion on animal welfare. To move the motion, I call Mr. Neil Parish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's a great pleasure to come in and introduce this debate on animal welfare. And the EFRA Committee report on animal welfare was published in